Individually, you are charged with capital amounts of science and the citizen status
Of all the stories written down in the Old Testament, I gotta say that the story of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood is my personal favorite. But oddly enough, the reason actually has nothing to do with the story itself. Rather, it has to do with the fact that so many people around the world still honestly believe that this event genuinely occurred exactly as it is written. Not as a myth, mind you, and not as an exaggerated local event, but as a literal, historical, worldwide flood. Yet the entire concept is so laughable that anyone with a grade school education can readily identify the bunk. This places Noah's Ark in a very special category of bizarre human beliefs, which makes it a worthwhile exercise to seriously pore over the story and understand the physical implications of a literal interpretation. Such analysis reveals a great deal about the comical absurdities contained within the Bible, as well as the depressing depths to which human thinking can plunge when it fails to exercise rational skepticism in matters of faith. For example, the most obvious problem with the universal flood is the issue of the floodwater itself. In order to cover the mountains, as the Bible says, the earth would have to be covered by a spherical shell of water no less than 29,000 feet thick. This water naturally had to come from somewhere, and the Bible itself is actually kind enough to tell us where. As the story goes, the waters came from the fountains of the great deep and entered through the windows of heaven. References such as this are actually very frequent throughout the Bible, and they stem from a common belief among ancient cultures. According to biblical historians, many cultures, including the ancient Hebrews, believed that the earth is like a flat disk covered by a spherical shell called the firmament. This structure basically floated like a giant bubble inside a vast body of primordial water, which is called the abyss or the deep. For example, this is the same water referred to in Genesis chapter 1 when God creates the firmament to divide the waters from the waters. So although the Bible itself gives a perfectly good account of where all this flood water is supposed to have come from, a literal interpretation also requires that the sky act as a solid barrier against a cosmic void of water that fills outer space. Given that so many biblical literalists want us to take the flood story seriously, it is a bit ironic how they simultaneously neglect to mention this little aspect of biblical cosmology, isn't it? Moving along, the next obvious problem concerns the gathering of samples from every last creature that moves along the ground. Now, to be fair, the Bible does imply that the critters came unto Noah out of their own accord. So we can be generous and assume that Noah did not necessarily have to track down and capture them all by hand. Say, for instance, that God just used his magical Jedi mind control to compel all the critters into taking a walk. And while we're at it, we can be very generous and assume that they even autonomously organize themselves into little well-behaved groups within the ark. Granting all of these concessions, Noah must still deal with the problem of geographic distribution. After all, emperor penguins live only in Antarctica, polar bears live only in the Arctic, half the marsupials are exclusively found in Australia, and everything else lives everywhere else in between. That means all these critters had to make their way across vast expanses of mountains, deserts, and oceans just to reach the ark. Worse yet, they still had to repeat that very same journey back to their respective geographies once the flood was over. If we also assume that plant and fungal varieties were carried on the ark as well, then Noah must further deal with the fact that trees and mushrooms can't exactly walk. So unless God also added teleportation to his repertoire of Jedi miracles, a literal interpretation of the story requires us to believe that penguins, polar bears, and acorns are all perfectly capable of walking and swimming the many thousands of miles both to and from the ark. Next, consider the problem of feeding the animals after they finally boarded the ark. According to the Bible, this task was expressly delegated to Noah by God himself. Consequently, there is very little wiggle room for God to step in and perform any miracles that might help make this job easy. On top of that, the Bible is also very specific that the flood itself lasted for the better part of a year. Noah must therefore deal with the fact that not all creatures can be expected to survive on rice and beans for that much time. For example, many species are obligate carnivores that survive exclusively by consuming the flesh of other creatures. So if we are going to take this story literally, then we must assume that Noah was somehow able to pack a year's worth of fresh meat for all of his predatory passengers to eat. And unless Noah also remembered to install a refrigerated meat locker onto his boat, not all of that food is going to last for the full duration of the flood. Worse still, think about the sheer volume of specialized diets that exist among the animal kingdom. For example, this little bugger here actually survives exclusively by consuming the eggs of this thing over here. Nothing else will do. So if Noah is going to be responsible for gathering food, then not only does he require access to this obscure piece of biological information, but he also needs to specifically take the time to gather and preserve a year-long supply of thrips eggs just for this creature alone. Yet there are literally millions upon millions of animal species alive today, most of which survive on very unique diets. So even if we completely ignore the issue of whether or not the ark even has enough physical volume to carry that much cargo, a literal historicity of this story still requires Noah to possess the logistical capacity to cater to the specialized dietary needs of each and every one of his millions of passengers. And as if that weren't bad enough, consider the implications of these creatures here. Not only do these creatures survive as obligate parasites on other organisms, but many of them also serve as vectors for the transmission of many common diseases. Some parasites, like our good friend Cestoda here, are even the direct cause of many diseases as well. Yet a literal interpretation of the story actually requires that Noah be careful enough to ensure the proper care and diet of every last one of these horrible little monsters. And that's not even the half of it. Even if Noah were to somehow pack enough food to last for the full duration of the flood, everyone must still deal with the problem of survival after the flood is over. After all, the whole point of the flood was to completely annihilate all life on land. That means every inland ecosystem on the planet would have been completely devastated, leaving nothing but a vast barren wasteland on which to forage. So unless God also decided to waive the biological necessity of eating food for a few decades, a literal interpretation implies that all animals can survive perfectly well in totally trashed ecosystems. Finally, God is very specific in his command that Noah's friends be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. However, God was also very specific that only 2 or 7 individuals from each species be saved on the ark. That means the only way for procreation to occur would be through lots and lots of inbreeding. Yet it is a well-established biological fact that inbreeding is a very quick and effective way to instill severe genetic disorders within offspring, not to mention a terrible susceptibility to disease. So if we're going to take this story literally, then we must accept that everything alive today is the biological product of recent incestuous reproduction. Now let's be frank for a moment and digress. We have not even begun to scratch the surface of the literal implications of Noah's Ark, and a comprehensive list could easily take hours to enumerate in full detail. Whether Christians realize it or not, this is exactly what a literal interpretation of the Great Deluge implies, and there is simply no physical evidence to remotely indicate any of it. Nothing in Earth's geology, nothing in modern archaeology, nothing in modern cosmology, nothing in life's genetic diversity, nothing in nautical engineering, and nothing in so much as basic fucking logistics can lend a shred of credibility to this story. It is also important to realize that human cultures have been concocting flood myths ever since the dawn of civilization itself. For crying out loud, people, the Indians had a flood myth, the Babylonians had a flood myth, the Greeks had a flood myth, the Incans had a flood myth, the Chinese had a flood myth. Practically everyone had a goddamn flood myth. So it is no stretch of the imagination that even the Hebrews would have one too. We are therefore perfectly justified in concluding that the whole biblical concept of a universal flood is just a made-up fairy tale. This conclusion is so obvious that it is painfully embarrassing when people actually try to take this crap seriously. If anything, one almost has to admire the bewildering display of mental gymnastics when Christian apologetics attempt to legitimize these events. So to all you faithful churchgoers out there who honestly hold to such a belief, I have just one question.
Is your head up your ass for the warmth?
So the biblical flood never happened. Is that really such a terrifying prospect? Even if it is just a story, it still makes for a great one. There's cute animals, a cool boat, evil villains, great mythology, and an awesome worldwide cataclysm. We spend perfectly good money to get this stuff from Hollywood movies, so why should there be anything wrong with getting it from the Bible? The only difference is that once we finish viewing Harry Potter, no one seriously goes around trying to convince us that Hogwarts is a real place.
These are not factual stories to be taken as historical events. They're really stories about how we should live our lives. They're moral homilies. What can I personally get out of the Bible for me today? That's what those stories are about. And to try to take them literally is you're missing the point of the Bible.
Unfortunately for Christians, this really is a terrifying prospect. The moment we allow for the possibility of biblical errancy, the historicity of the entire document immediately becomes suspect. That means if we concede that the Great Deluge never happened, we must also ask ourselves, what else never happened? Did Moses really part the Red Sea? Did Adam and Eve really eat the forbidden fruit? Or worst of all, did Jesus really rise from the dead? The only way around such uncertainty is to try and substantiate the alleged events through rigorous empirical evidence based on disciplined historical and archaeological methods. Yet everyone knows that corroborating physical evidence is virtually non-existent, and that the only intellectually honest recourse is to reject the factual validity of the whole thing. This is why Christians cannot let go of the flood story. Once any part of the Bible is in doubt, then all of it is in doubt, and that is not an option which the true believers are allowed to concede.
You see, when we take the Bible, the book of Genesis is like a foundation, and the rest of the Bible is like a structure. And if you take out the foundational book of Genesis away from the Bible, then the whole structure comes down. And once that structure comes down, then the whole foundation of Christianity is gone.
So in the end, the real lesson of Noah's Ark has nothing to do with faith, history, or spiritual growth. Rather, Noah's Ark is a humbling demonstration of the raw power of human self-deception. When otherwise perfectly sane and intelligent people are capable of standing in such stubborn defiance of reality, what does this say about the rest of us? Whether we be poets, statesmen, scientists, or cab drivers, none of us are immune to the intrinsic capacity for generating staunch convictions in the absolute truth of completely fictional nonsense. The only treatment for such lunacy is to humbly accept the power it has over us and to take active measures in avoiding its pitfalls. This is exactly why science has so many strict rules for establishing the validity of a claim. It is a courageous regimen of intellectual and skeptical discipline that works hard to counteract our fallible nature. Unless we do our best to abide by its precepts, then there is no limit to the variety of embarrassing flood stories that will burrow themselves into our minds and hopelessly corrupt our understanding of nature.